Some families bury their dead. The Ravenshire's buried their heirs. The silver tray slipped from Aurielle Whitford's hands and struck the marble floor with a crack that echoed through the east gallery of Blackmere Hall like a pistol shot. Porcelain shattered. Tea spread across the black and white tiles in thin streams that reflected the chandelier light above. Every servant in the corridor froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Because at the far end of the gallery, standing beside the towering windows that overlooked the winter gardens, the Duke of Blackmere had stopped walking. Lucien Ravensshire did not stop for accidents. He did not stop for servants. He barely stopped for people of his own rank. Yet there he stood in complete stillness, one gloved hand resting lightly against the silver wolf-head cane he carried during cold weather, his gray eyes fixed not on the broken porcelain at Aurielle's feet but on the inside of her wrist. The sleeve of her faded servant uniform had fallen back several inches when the tray slipped. A pale birthmark curved against her skin like the outline of a crescent moon. The Duke stared at it without blinking. The corridor became unnaturally quiet. Even the grandfather clock near the stairwell seemed to soften its ticking. Aurielle lowered her arm immediately. "I'm sorry, Your Grace." Her voice came out softer than she intended. Lucien Ravensshire did not answer. For one strange second, his expression changed. Not anger, not irritation. Something colder. Something dangerously close to recognition. Then the moment disappeared. His face became unreadable again. "Leave us," he said quietly. The footmen exchanged nervous glances before retreating at once. The other maids hurried away with lowered heads, their shoes whispering against the marble floors until only Aurielle and the Duke remained beneath the long row of crystal chandeliers. She kept her eyes lowered. Servants who looked directly at the Duke rarely kept their positions for long. Blackmere Hall operated on rules older than London itself. Silence, efficiency, invisibility. Aurielle had survived 2 years in the estate by mastering all three. Lucien stepped closer. The polished heel of his boot stopped inches from the broken porcelain. "What is your name?" he asked. Aurielle hesitated. The question unsettled her more than his tone. The Duke did not ask servants for their names. "Aurielle Whitford, Your Grace." He repeated it once beneath his breath, as if testing whether the sound belonged to her. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years, sir." His gaze remained on her wrist. "Who hired you?" "Mrs. Hollowmere, Your Grace." Another silence followed. Heavy. Measuring. Aurielle could hear the distant howl of wind against the manor windows. Outside, snow had begun to fall over the northern cliffs surrounding Blackmere Hall. Winter always arrived early in Northumberland. Lucien finally lifted his eyes to her face. She wished he had not. The Duke's stare carried the strange weight of someone searching through memory rather than simply looking at another person. "You were born where?" he asked. "A village called Dunmere, sir. About 30 miles south of here." "Your parents?" "Dead." The answer came automatically. It always did. Her mother had died 5 winters ago. The man she believed was her father had passed long before that from a fever that swept through the fishing villages along the coast. Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who told you that?" Aurielle blinked once. "Sir, who told you they were your parents?" Her breath caught. No one had ever asked her that question before. Not once in 22 years. "My mother raised me," she answered carefully. "That is not what I asked." The air between them shifted. Something invisible and sharp settled into the corridor. Aurielle felt it immediately. The Duke knew something. She did not know how or why, but suddenly the floor beneath her felt less stable than it had moments ago. Lucien looked at her for another long second before stepping back. Whatever he had almost said vanished behind the cold discipline of his expression. "Clean this mess," he said. "Then report to the East Wing at 8 tomorrow morning." Aurielle stared before she could stop herself. "The East Wing, Your Grace? Do you have difficulty hearing?" "No, sir." No servant entered the East Wing unless ordered directly. Most of the rooms there remained locked year-round. The older maids whispered about them constantly during late kitchen hours. Empty nurseries, covered portraits, fires that had nearly destroyed half the manor 18 years ago. Some said the Ravenshire's kept ghosts there. Others claimed the Duke himself avoided that side of the estate after dark. Lucien turned away without another word. His long coat swept lightly behind him as he disappeared down the corridor. Aurielle remained frozen beside the shattered porcelain until the sound of his footsteps vanished entirely. Only then did she kneel to gather the broken pieces with trembling hands. By dinner hour, the entire servants' wing knew what had happened. Blackmere Hall breathed gossip through its walls faster than wind through cracked windows. Aurielle felt the stares immediately when she entered the downstairs kitchen carrying fresh linens. Conversations stopped. A pair of young maids near the ovens lowered their voices. Mrs. Hollowmere, the head housekeeper, looked up sharply from the account ledger she reviewed every evening beside the pantry door. Her narrow face hardened the moment she saw Aurielle. "You," she said. Aurielle stopped walking. "Yes, ma'am. My office. Now." The kitchen fell silent as Aurielle followed the older woman through the narrow servants' corridor behind the pantry. Mrs. Hollowmere's office smelled faintly of lavender water and old paper. Every shelf stood perfectly arranged. Every pen aligned precisely beside stacks of household records. The woman closed the door behind them with controlled force. "What happened in the gallery?" she demanded. Aurielle kept her hands folded in front of her apron. "I dropped a tray. Do not insult me with stupidity." Mrs. Hollowmere's voice sharpened. "His Grace spoke to you for nearly 5 minutes." Aurielle said nothing. The older woman stared at her with open suspicion now. Not irritation. Fear. Aurielle recognized the difference immediately. "What did he ask you?" Mrs. Hollowmere pressed. "My name. Where I was born." The housekeeper's expression shifted for half a second before recovering. Too quickly for most people to notice. Not quickly enough for Aurielle. "And nothing else." Mrs. Hollowmere walked toward the window overlooking the rear courtyard. Snow drifted silently across the cobblestones outside. "You are not to speak unnecessarily to His Grace," she said at last. "You are not to answer questions beyond what is required. And if you are summoned anywhere inside the East Wing tomorrow, you will keep your eyes lowered and your mouth closed. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." The older woman turned slowly. "There are matters in this house that do not concern servants." Aurielle nodded. "Of course." "Good." Mrs. Hollowmere paused. "You may go." Aurielle reached the door before the woman spoke again. "Aurielle." She turned slightly. "Yes, ma'am?" The housekeeper studied her face carefully. "Did your mother ever tell you where that mark on your wrist came from?" Aurielle instinctively covered the crescent-shaped birthmark beneath her sleeve. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Hollowmere's eyes darkened with something unreadable. "I see." Aurielle left without another word, but unease followed her through every corridor afterward. Something had changed inside Blackmere Hall the moment the Duke saw her wrist. She felt it in the silence that followed her through the servants' quarters. She felt it in the nervous glances exchanged whenever she entered a room. And later that night, as snow covered the cliffs beyond the estate and the great house settled into darkness, Lucien Ravensshire unlocked a drawer hidden behind the shelves of his private study and removed a leather file bound with fading black ribbon. The front page carried only 4 words written in precise ink. "The Ashbourne Child." Beneath the title rested a sketch drawn 18 years earlier by an unknown hand. A child's wrist. A crescent-shaped mark. Lucien stared at the drawing for a very long time before quietly saying into the empty room, "Where have you been all this time?" The most dangerous secrets are usually hidden in plain sight. Aurielle Whitford had spent 2 years learning how to disappear inside Blackmere Hall. She understood which floorboards creaked near the western staircase. She knew which footmen drank too much cider after midnight and which maids stole sugar cubes from the kitchen pantry when Mrs. Hollowmere was not watching. She knew how to cross an entire ballroom carrying silver trays without a single noble guest remembering her face afterward. In great houses like Blackmere, invisibility was survival. That was why the change frightened her. By the next morning, people looked at her differently. Not openly. Blackmere servants were too disciplined for open curiosity. But the difference remained there all the same. A pause before conversation resumed. A glance held 1 second too long. A silence that formed the moment she entered a room. Aurielle felt all of it as she carried fresh towels through the lower corridor shortly before 7:30. Even the younger kitchen maids stopped whispering when she passed them near the servants' staircase. One of them nearly dropped a basket of apples after noticing Aurielle watching her. The girl quickly lowered her eyes. Aurielle continued walking. The east wing waited at the far end of the manor beyond a series of narrow corridors rarely used by staff. Blackmere Hall was enormous even by aristocratic standards. More than 60 rooms stretched across the estate, connected through galleries lined with oil paintings, velvet runners, and towering windows overlooking the frozen cliffs above the North Sea. Most guests admired the western side of the house where the grand ballroom, music room, and drawing salons stood in polished perfection. The east wing was different, quieter, older. The walls there carried the faint smell of cedar and fireplace ash no matter the season. By 8 o'clock precisely, Aurielle stood outside the carved oak doors leading into the private eastern corridor. Mrs. Hollowmere waited beside them holding a ring of iron keys. The older woman's posture looked even stiffer than usual. "You will clean only the rooms assigned to you," she said coldly. "You will not touch locked cabinets. You will not open drawers. You will not read documents left on desks. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hollowmere studied her for another moment. "His Grace values privacy above all things." Aurielle nodded. "Of course." The housekeeper unlocked the doors. The hinges opened with a slow groan that echoed softly down the corridor beyond. Dust floated through pale morning light spilling from the tall windows facing the sea. The east wing felt untouched by time. Portraits covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Generations of Ravenshire's stared down from gold frames with expressions ranging from bored indifference to quiet arrogance. Aurielle followed Mrs. Hollowmere deeper into the corridor until they reached a pair of dark blue doors near the far end. "The Duke's private study," the housekeeper said. "You will dust the shelves, clean the fireplace, and replace the flowers near the south window." Aurielle blinked slightly. "Flowers?" "His Grace prefers white lilies." The answer surprised her more than it should have. Lucian Ravensshire did not seem like a man who cared about flowers. Mrs. Hollowmere unlocked the study. "You have 1 hour." Aurielle stepped inside. The room was larger than the cottage where she grew up. Dark shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books and sealed document cases. A massive fireplace stood opposite the windows overlooking the cliffs. Heavy navy curtains framed the morning light. Everything in the room reflected restraint, discipline, control. Then Aurielle noticed the flowers. White lilies rested in a silver vase beside the south window exactly where Mrs. Hollowmere had said. Freshly cut, carefully arranged. She did not know why the sight unsettled her. The housekeeper remained near the doorway. "Do not wander," she warned before finally leaving and locking the outer corridor behind her. Aurielle stood alone in silence. Somewhere beyond the windows, waves crashed against the rocks far below the cliffs. She exhaled slowly and began working. Dusting shelves required care because many of the older books looked centuries old. Aurielle moved methodically through the room, careful not to disturb the perfect arrangement of everything around her. She avoided looking directly at the Duke's desk for as long as possible. Eventually curiosity won. The desk sat near the fireplace beneath a large portrait of a dark-haired woman dressed in silver silk. She looked striking even by noble standards. Cold gray eyes, elegant posture, a Ravenshire without question. Aurielle recognized the Duke's features immediately in the line of the woman's jaw. His mother, perhaps. The desk itself remained unervingly organized. Every paper aligned perfectly. Every pen resting parallel beside the inkstand. No personal letters. No loose documents. Nothing unnecessary. The only unusual object rested near the corner beside the candle holder. A small silver pocket watch engraved with an unfamiliar crest. Aurielle glanced at it only briefly before looking away again. Servants who touched noble belongings rarely kept their employment. She crossed toward the south window carrying fresh flowers from the hallway basket Mrs. Hollowmere had prepared earlier. Snow drifted softly beyond the glass. The cliffs below Blackmere disappeared beneath pale morning fog. The sea looked almost white beneath the winter sky. Aurielle carefully removed the old lilies from the vase. One stem slipped from her fingers and rolled beneath the desk. She sighed quietly before kneeling to retrieve it. Her hand brushed against something hidden under the desk panel. Paper. Aurielle froze. A single folded page rested partly concealed near the inner wooden frame, as though it had fallen there accidentally. She should have ignored it. Every instinct told her to stand up immediately. Instead, she pulled the paper free. The page contained a charcoal sketch. A child. A little girl no older than 5 sitting beside a window with long pale hair falling over one shoulder. Aurielle's breath caught. The child wore a necklace shaped like a crescent moon. The exact same crescent shape as the birthmark on Aurielle's wrist. She stared at the drawing in complete stillness. There was something deeply familiar about the child's eyes. Not identical, not entirely, but close enough to send unease crawling slowly through her chest. A sound behind her shattered the silence. Aurielle stood instantly. The sketch nearly slipped from her hands as the study door opened. Lucien Ravenshire entered without warning. Snow clung lightly to the shoulders of his black coat from outside. His gray eyes moved immediately to the page in her hands. Neither of them spoke. Aurielle lowered the paper at once. "I'm sorry, Your Grace." It fell beneath the desk. Lucien closed the door quietly behind him. "Come here." The words were calm. That frightened her more than anger would have. Aurielle obeyed. She crossed the room slowly until she stood several feet from him beside the fireplace. Lucien held out his hand for the sketch. She gave it to him immediately. His eyes lowered to the charcoal drawing for several seconds before lifting back to her face. "Do you recognize this child?" he asked. "No, sir." "You hesitated." Aurielle swallowed lightly. She looked familiar. Why? She did not know how to answer without sounding foolish. "The necklace," she said quietly. "It resembles my birthmark." Lucien became very still again. The same dangerous stillness from yesterday's corridor. His gaze lowered briefly toward the hidden crescent beneath her sleeve before returning to her eyes. "What exactly did your mother tell you about that mark?" he asked. "Nothing, sir. She only said I was born with it." "And your father?" "He died when I was young." "Did you ever see your birth records?" No. Lucien looked away toward the window overlooking the cliffs. For the first time since she met him, Aurielle noticed exhaustion beneath the control in his expression. Not physical exhaustion. Something older. He remained silent long enough for the fireplace logs to crack softly behind them. Finally he spoke without turning around. "Some truths destroy lives once they are uncovered." Aurielle frowned slightly. "Sir." Lucien faced her again. His expression had already hardened back into noble restraint. "You will continue working in the East Wing from now on." Surprise crossed her face before she could hide it. "Your Grace." "Beginning today." Mrs. Hollowmere said those duties belong to senior staff. "Mrs. Hollowmere answers to me." His tone ended the matter immediately. Aurielle lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir." Lucien studied her one final moment before walking toward the door. His hand rested briefly against the handle. "Aurielle." "Yes, Your Grace." "Do not trust anyone in this house too easily." Then he left her standing alone beside the fire with the strange feeling that the floor beneath Blackmere Hall had begun shifting in ways no one could stop anymore. A house begins to fear a person long before it admits the truth about them. Snow continued falling across Blackmere Hall for the next 3 days. Thick gray clouds rolled over the northern cliffs and swallowed the sea until the world beyond the manor looked empty and endless. Inside the estate, fires burned continuously in every occupied room. Servants moved through corridors carrying coal buckets, fresh linens, and silver trays of tea, while the Ravensshire household prepared for the annual winter assembly that would take place the following Saturday evening. Every noble family within 40 miles had already confirmed attendance. Blackmere Hall had not hosted a major gathering in nearly 4 years. The announcement alone had unsettled the county. Aurielle noticed the tension immediately. Footmen polished chandeliers late into the night. Seamstresses arrived from town carrying bolts of velvet and silk for the guest chambers. Extra flowers filled the lower kitchens every morning. White roses, winter lilies, dark blue hydrangeas imported from London. Yet beneath the preparation, another mood moved quietly through the house. Unease. Servants lowered their voices whenever the Duke entered a room. Mrs. Hollowmere became stricter with every passing hour. Twice Aurielle caught the older woman staring at her from the far ends of corridors with an expression that looked dangerously close to panic. The East Wing became Aurielle's permanent assignment exactly as Lucien had ordered. No one questioned it aloud. That alone felt strange. Blackmere Hall ran on rigid hierarchy. Senior staff guarded privileges carefully. Yet none of the older maids protested when Aurielle replaced them in the private eastern rooms. They simply avoided her afterward. On Thursday morning, Aurielle entered the Duke's study shortly after 8 carrying fresh flowers and clean fireplace linens. The room remained exactly as she left it the previous evening. Perfectly ordered. Perfectly still. She moved quietly between the shelves, replacing candles burned low during the night. Lucien clearly slept very little. Several books lay open near the desk alongside estate ledgers and parliamentary documents covered in neat black handwriting. Aurielle avoided reading any of it directly. Still, she noticed patterns. Dates circled repeatedly. Family names underlined. One name appeared more often than the others. Ashbourne. The same name she had seen inside the leather file days earlier. She was replacing the lilies near the south window when the study door opened unexpectedly behind her. Aurielle turned at once. A woman entered carrying herself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to noble houses. She wore a dark green riding coat trimmed with black fur, expensive gloves, and a hat decorated with raven feathers. Snow dusted lightly across her shoulders. She stopped the moment she saw Aurielle. Surprise flickered briefly across her sharp features before disappearing beneath polite composure. "You are new," the woman said. Aurielle lowered her eyes immediately. "No, ma'am." "Interesting." The woman removed one glove slowly while studying her face. "I know every servant employed in this house." Aurielle remained silent. The stranger walked farther into the study. Her boots clicked softly against the polished floorboards. "What is your name?" "Aurielle Whitford, ma'am." Something changed in the woman's expression. Small. Immediate. Her fingers tightened slightly around the leather gloves she carried. "Whitford," she repeated. "How curious." Before Aurielle could answer, another voice entered the room. "You should not be interrogating my staff before breakfast, Seraphine." Lucien Ravenshayer stood in the doorway behind them. He wore a dark charcoal coat over a black waistcoat, his silver wolf-head cane resting loosely in one hand. The cold morning light behind him sharpened the severe lines of his face. Lady Seraphine Vale smiled instantly. The transformation looked practiced. "I was introducing myself." Lucien's eyes moved briefly toward Aurielle. "Leave the flowers and go downstairs." Aurielle curtsied immediately. "Yes, Your Grace." She crossed the room quickly without looking up again, but she felt Lady Seraphine watching her the entire way to the door. The moment Aurielle stepped into the corridor, the voices inside the study lowered behind her. She should have continued downstairs. Instead, she slowed near the corner beside the tapestry alcove where the heavy walls muffled sound imperfectly. "You brought her here," Seraphine said quietly from inside the study. Lucien answered without emotion. "I did not bring her anywhere. Do not insult me. You moved her into the East Wing within hours." Pause followed. Aurielle remained perfectly still beside the corridor wall. "You saw the mark?" Seraphine asked. "Yes." Silence again. Then the woman spoke more softly. "After 18 years? Apparently. This cannot become public." Lucien's voice turned colder. "You seem very concerned about that." "Because I understand what happens if old scandals return." Aurielle heard footsteps crossing the study floor. The Ashbourne matter was buried for a reason. Lucien answered immediately. Buried things have a habit of resurfacing. Aurielle stepped away from the alcove at once as another servant approached carrying firewood down the corridor. She continued walking before anyone noticed her listening. Her pulse felt unsteady all through the morning afterward. Ashbourne again. The same name, the same fear. And now Lady Seraphine knew it too. By late afternoon, the snowfall finally stopped. Pale sunlight touched the frozen cliffs beyond Blackmere Hall for the first time in days. Aurielle carried fresh towels toward the upper guest chambers shortly before dinner when she noticed movement through one of the western windows overlooking the front courtyard. Riders approached the estate. At least 6 carriages rolled through the iron gates bearing noble crests painted in gold and silver along their doors. Guests had begun arriving early for the winter assembly. Blackmere Hall transformed immediately. Footmen lined the entrance hall. Servants hurried between floors carrying luggage. Fires blazed brighter throughout the manor. Aurielle spent the next several hours assisting the upstairs staff with chamber preparation until exhaustion settled heavily into her shoulders. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally returned to the east corridor carrying clean linens for the Duke's private rooms. The manor had grown quieter again. Distant music drifted faintly from the western drawing room where some guests gathered after dinner. Aurielle moved carefully through the dim corridor lit only by wall sconces and fireplace glow. As she passed the locked blue doors near the end of the hallway, she heard something inside. Piano music. Soft. Slow. She stopped without meaning to. No one used the Eastern music room anymore. At least that was what the servants claimed. Yet the melody continued drifting beneath the door in perfect quiet notes. Aurielle stepped closer. The music sounded strangely familiar despite the fact she had never heard it before. A simple lullaby, perhaps. The kind mothers sang beside fireplaces late at night. Without realizing it, she placed one hand against the door. The music stopped instantly. Silence flooded the corridor. Aurielle pulled her hand back at once. Then the handle turned slowly from the inside. The door opened several inches. Lucien Ravenshayer stood within the darkened room beside a black grand piano. Firelight flickered softly across the sharp angles of his face. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Aurielle realized she had never seen the Duke look tired before now. Not physically tired. Something deeper than that. "I'm sorry, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I did not mean to interrupt." Lucien rested one hand against the piano lid. "Do you know that song?" Aurielle hesitated. "No, sir." "Then why did you stop?" She searched for an answer that made sense. It sounded familiar. His expression changed slightly. Not surprise exactly. Recognition again. Dangerous recognition. The same look from the gallery days ago. Lucien studied her for another long moment before speaking. "My mother used to play that song." Aurielle lowered her eyes respectfully. "It is beautiful." No, his voice became quieter. "It was forgotten." The corridor fell silent again except for the distant crackle of firewood burning somewhere deeper inside the manor. Then Lucien asked a question so suddenly that Aurielle almost looked up in shock. "What is the earliest thing you remember?" She blinked once. "Sir, your earliest memory." Aurielle tried to answer immediately but found herself hesitating instead. Strange. She had never thought carefully about it before. "I remember snow," she said slowly, "and a woman singing." Lucien became completely motionless beside the piano. Aurielle frowned faintly as fragments of memory drifted unexpectedly through her mind. Candlelight, velvet curtains, the scent of cedar smoke, a silver necklace catching firelight while someone laughed softly nearby. The images appeared only for seconds before vanishing again. "I do not remember faces," she admitted quietly. "Only pieces." Lucien looked at her as though the floor beneath the manor had just shifted again. Then footsteps echoed suddenly from the far corridor. Lady Seraphine appeared moments later beneath the wall sconces wearing a dark evening gown trimmed with black lace. She stopped immediately upon seeing them standing together. Her gaze moved from Lucien to Aurielle and back again. The silence sharpened instantly. Seraphine smiled first. "There you are, Lucien. Your guests are asking for you downstairs." Lucien did not answer right away. His eyes remained on Aurielle another second before he finally stepped back into the music room. "Return to your duties," he said calmly. Aurielle curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." She walked away without looking behind her again, but she felt Lady Seraphine's stare following her the entire length of the corridor like a shadow that already knew something terrible was beginning to wake inside Blackmere Hall. Memory does not disappear. It waits. Saturday evening arrived beneath a sky the color of iron. Snow covered the cliffs surrounding Blackmere Hall in smooth white layers that reflected moonlight like polished glass. Carriages rolled steadily through the front gates from late afternoon onward, their wheels crunching against frozen gravel, while lanterns flickered through the falling mist. By 6 o'clock, the estate glowed with candlelight from nearly every window. The winter assembly had begun. Aurielle stood beside the upper servants' corridor, fastening the final buttons on a dark gray service dress freshly pressed for the evening. The fabric felt stiffer than usual against her skin. Mrs. Hollowmere insisted the East Wing staff appear immaculate tonight. "No mistakes," the housekeeper warned hours earlier while inspecting the servants one by one. "Half the county is inside this house." Aurielle lowered her eyes obediently and said nothing. She had learned quickly that silence protected her better than curiosity ever could. Yet silence had become difficult since the Duke started watching her. She felt it constantly now, across corridors, during dinner preparation, even in passing moments when Lucien Ravenshire said nothing at all. It was never the stare of a man admiring a woman. That would have been simpler. This was different, colder, more dangerous, as though he were comparing her existence against memories no one else could see. Downstairs, music drifted upward from the ballroom in soft waves of strings and piano. Guests filled Blackmere Hall completely now. Noblewomen moved through the galleries wearing velvet gowns in deep winter colors, while jeweled necklaces flashed beneath chandelier light. Men gathered near fireplaces discussing politics, land investments, and parliament in voices polished smooth by generations of privilege. Servants crossed invisibly between them carrying silver trays of champagne and crystal glasses of amber whiskey imported from Scotland. Aurielle spent most of the evening near the Eastern Reception Gallery assisting with wine service. The work itself remained simple. Walk quietly, refill glasses, lower your eyes, disappear. Yet disappearing became impossible the moment Lucien entered the ballroom. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations softened. People shifted subtly to watch him cross the room. The Duke of Blackmere carried authority the way storms carried cold. Effortlessly, he wore black evening formal wear trimmed with dark silver embroidery across the cuffs and collar. No medals, no decorative excess, only quiet power. Lady Seraphine remained beside him throughout most of the evening, elegant in a midnight blue gown that caught candlelight like dark water. They looked perfectly matched. Cold, beautiful, untouchable. Aurielle kept her attention lowered while passing through the ballroom with a tray of champagne flutes. She almost reached the western archway before a voice stopped her. "You there?" Aurielle turned immediately. A young noblewoman stood near the grand staircase holding an empty glass. Her blonde curls shimmered beneath the chandelier light. "More champagne," the woman said lazily without really looking at her. "Of course, ma'am." Aurielle stepped forward carefully. As she reached for the empty glass, another woman nearby laughed softly. "Blackmere hires prettier servants than London clubs these days." The women smiled among themselves. Aurielle kept her expression perfectly neutral. Years of service had taught her how to absorb humiliation without reaction. "Perhaps that explains why the Duke finally reopened the estate," another lady added. "Even Lucien Ravenshire must grow tired of ghosts eventually." Quiet laughter followed. Aurielle handed over the fresh champagne flute and stepped back immediately. Then someone else spoke from behind the group. "I disagree." The women turned together. Lord Cedric Vale approached holding a whiskey glass loosely in one hand. He was Lady Seraphine's younger brother. Tall, charming, too observant. Aurielle recognized him from previous visits to Blackmere Hall. Cedric's eyes moved directly toward her. "The servant has remarkable posture," he said casually. "Not village-born posture either." One of the women laughed again. Cedric, honestly. I am serious. His gaze remained on Aurielle. Lift your chin. Aurielle froze. The request sounded harmless. It was not. Servants did not raise their heads before nobility unless ordered directly by household authority. The surrounding women watched with growing amusement. Do it, Cedric repeated lightly. Slowly, Aurielle obeyed. Candlelight touched her face fully for the first time. Silence followed. Small. Immediate. One of the noble women blinked. Another lowered her glass slightly. Cedric studied her with narrowed eyes. Interesting, he murmured. Aurielle looked down again at once. May I return to my duties, sir? Cedric did not answer immediately. What is your name? Aurielle Whitford. Something shifted in his expression. Briefly. Whitford. Before Aurielle could respond, another voice cut smoothly across the ballroom. Lord Cedric. The atmosphere tightened instantly. Lucian Ravensshire stood several feet away beside the staircase, one hand resting behind his back. His expression revealed nothing. That somehow made him more intimidating. Cedric smiled faintly. Lucian, you appear to be interrogating my staff again. The surrounding women lowered their eyes almost immediately. Even Cedric's posture changed subtly beneath the Duke's attention. Only making conversation. Lucian's gaze moved once toward Aurielle. Calm. Controlled. Return to the East Gallery, he said. Aurielle curtsied immediately. Yes, Your Grace. She turned away at once, but not before noticing the way Cedric continued watching her as she disappeared through the ballroom crowd. The East Gallery stood quieter than the main ballroom. Large windows overlooked the moonlit cliffs while smaller groups of nobles gathered beside fireplaces discussing politics and marriage alliances. Aurielle resumed serving wine there until nearly 10:30 when Mrs. Hollowmere suddenly appeared beside her. The Duke requires fresh documents from his study, the housekeeper said sharply. Immediately, Aurielle handed off her tray without question. Yes, ma'am. She crossed the eastern corridors quickly, grateful for the silence away from the ballroom noise. The manor felt different at night. Darker. Older. Candlelight flickered softly against portraits lining the walls while distant music drifted through the house like something half-remembered. Aurielle reached Lucian's study moments later and unlocked the door with the east wing key Mrs. Hollowmere had entrusted to her earlier that week. The room remained dim except for firelight burning low near the hearth. She crossed toward the desk searching for the requested papers. Several sealed folders rested neatly near the inkstand exactly where Lucian usually kept estate correspondence. Aurielle gathered them carefully. One document slipped free unexpectedly as she lifted the stack. The page landed open across the desk. Aurielle looked down instinctively. Her breath stopped. It was a birth record. The paper appeared old and fragile around the edges. Several names had faded with time. Yet one line remained painfully clear beneath the candlelight. Female child born December 14, 1804. House Ashbourne. Crescent identification mark confirmed. Aurielle stared without moving. December 14th. Her birthday. A cold sensation spread slowly through her chest. She reached toward the page before stopping herself abruptly. No, this was impossible. The study door opened behind her. Aurielle turned immediately. Lucian stood there alone now, shadows moving across his face from the firelight. His eyes lowered once toward the document in her hands. Neither of them spoke. Aurielle placed the page down carefully. I did not mean to read it, Your Grace. Lucian closed the door behind him. But you did. The paper fell. He stepped farther into the room. And what did you see? Aurielle struggled briefly for composure. A birth record. Lucian remained silent. The fire crackled softly behind them. The date matched mine, she admitted quietly. Yes. Her fingers tightened around the documents she still carried. What is House Ashbourne? Lucian looked at her for a very long moment before answering. A family that no longer officially exists. Officially. They disappeared 18 years ago after a fire destroyed most of their northern estate. Aurielle's heartbeat felt strangely uneven now. And the child? Lucien's eyes moved toward the birth record still resting on the desk. The child disappeared the same night. Silence filled the room again. Heavy. Unavoidable. Aurielle forced herself to breathe steadily. "Why are you showing me this?" Lucien answered without hesitation. "Because I believe the child survived." Aurielle stared at him. The firelight flickered softly across his expression, revealing something she had never seen there before. Not certainty. Fear. Real fear hidden beneath all the Duke's control. Then voices echoed suddenly from the corridor outside. Lucien's expression hardened instantly. "Hide the document," he said quietly. Aurielle obeyed without question, sliding the birth record beneath the other papers just as the study door opened again. Lady Seraphine entered without waiting for permission. Her eyes moved immediately between them. Aurielle noticed it at once. The tension, the calculation. Seraphine smiled slowly. "There you are, Lucien. Everyone is searching for you downstairs." Her gaze shifted toward the desk. "Am I interrupting something?" Lucien's face revealed nothing. No. Seraphine stepped farther into the room, elegant and controlled beneath the candlelight. Yet when her eyes landed briefly on Aurielle's wrist where the servant's sleeve had shifted back several inches, the color drained slightly from her face before recovering. Aurielle saw it clearly. So did Lucien. And in that moment, the silence inside Blackmere Hall no longer felt like mystery. It felt like the beginning of war. People reveal themselves fastest when they think the truth is about to escape them. The study remained silent after Lady Seraphine entered. Firelight flickered softly across the dark shelves while snow brushed faintly against the windows overlooking the cliffs. Aurielle stood beside the desk holding the sealed documents against her chest, aware of every breath inside the room. Seraphine's smile never fully reached her eyes. "The ballroom is beginning to wonder whether Blackmere's master intends to abandon his own gathering," she said lightly. Lucien closed the distance toward the fireplace with slow, controlled steps. "Then the ballroom must learn patience." Seraphine laughed softly, still charming as ever. Her attention drifted briefly toward Aurielle again. "I did not realize your staff now assists with private estate records." Aurielle lowered her eyes immediately. Lucien answered before she could speak. "Miss Whitford follows instructions well." "I see." Seraphine removed one satin glove finger by finger while studying Aurielle's face with unnerving calm. "How long have you worked here, Miss Whitford?" 2 years, ma'am." "And before that?" "I lived in Dunmere Village. With family." Aurielle hesitated slightly. "My mother passed away several years ago." Seraphine tilted her head almost imperceptibly. "How unfortunate." The sympathy sounded carefully constructed rather than genuine. Lucien's voice cut through the room again. "You may return downstairs, Aurielle." Relief moved quietly through her chest. "Yes, Your Grace." She curtsied once and crossed toward the door. As she passed Lady Seraphine, the woman spoke again without turning fully toward her. "Have we met before?" Aurielle stopped instinctively. "No, ma'am." "Strange." Seraphine's tone remained smooth. "You have a familiar face." Aurielle forced herself not to touch the hidden birthmark beneath her sleeve. "I do not believe we have met." "Perhaps not." Seraphine smiled faintly. "Memory becomes unreliable with age." Aurielle left the study immediately afterward. The moment the corridor door closed behind her, she exhaled for what felt like the first time in several minutes. Something inside that room had shifted permanently tonight. She felt certain of it. The birth record, the missing child, the fear in Seraphine's eyes when she noticed the crescent mark. None of it felt accidental anymore. Aurielle descended the eastern staircase slowly while distant music drifted upward through the manor. Below, the winter assembly continued in full brilliance. Noble guests laughed beneath chandeliers. Crystal glasses clinked softly. String musicians played another waltz from the ballroom gallery, while servants moved invisibly through the glittering crowds. Yet Blackmere Hall no longer felt beautiful to Aurielle tonight. Felt watchful. She crossed into the servants' passage behind the ballroom, intending to return the sealed documents to Mrs. Hollowmere when voices stopped her near the pantry corridor. Male voices. Low. Familiar. Aurielle slowed instinctively before realizing one belonged to Cedric Vale. You are hiding something from me? Cedric said quietly. Careful, another man answered with nervous amusement. That sounds dangerously close to accusing the Duke of secrets. Cedric laughed once beneath his breath. Lucien Ravensshire practically breathes secrets. Aurielle remained perfectly still behind the corridor archway. You noticed the servant girl tonight? Cedric continued. Which one? The dark-haired one. Pause followed. Pretty enough, the other man admitted. But hardly worth your attention. Cedric's voice lowered slightly. That is not what interested me. Silence again. Then the man spoke more carefully. You think she resembles someone? Cedric did not answer immediately. Aurielle felt her pulse quicken. Impossible, the second man muttered a moment later. The Ashbourne child died years ago. Cedric finally answered. Did she? Aurielle stepped backward at once before they could continue. Her breathing had become uneven now. The Ashbourne child again. Everyone inside Blackmere seemed to know the name except her. She hurried through the servants' corridor until reaching the lower kitchen where heat and noise immediately surrounded her again. Mrs. Hollowmere stood near the preparation tables directing the staff with sharp efficiency. The older woman looked up the moment Aurielle entered. Where are the documents? Aurielle handed over the sealed folders immediately. His Grace asked me to return them. Mrs. Hollowmere accepted the papers stiffly. You were gone too long. I apologize, ma'am. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. Did Lady Seraphine speak with you? Aurielle hesitated before answering truthfully. Yes. About what? Nothing important. Mrs. Hollowmere stared at her long enough to make the younger maids nearby uncomfortable. Finally she lowered her voice. Avoid Lady Seraphine whenever possible. Aurielle blinked softly. Ma'am. You heard me. The older woman turned away abruptly before adding one final sentence. Some people survive by protecting the truth. Others survive by burying it. Aurielle watched her walk toward the pantry without another word. By midnight, the winter assembly finally began thinning. Several older guests retired upstairs while younger nobles continued drinking near the Western Music Salon. Snow fell again outside, softer now, covering carriage tracks beneath fresh white powder. Aurielle spent the next hour extinguishing candles throughout the East Gallery alongside two other maids. The manor gradually quieted around them. One by one, fireplaces dimmed. Doors closed. Music faded into distant silence. It was nearly 1 o'clock when Aurielle finally carried the last silver tray toward the lower kitchens alone. The servants' corridors had emptied almost completely by then. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone floors as she crossed beneath the eastern stairwell. Then she noticed the door, slightly open. The small blue door beneath the servants' staircase was almost never unlocked. Aurielle had passed it countless times without thought. Tonight warm candlelight spilled faintly through the narrow opening. She slowed instinctively. Curiosity pulled at her despite herself. The room beyond appeared tiny, more like a storage chamber than an actual office. Aurielle glanced down the empty corridor once before stepping closer. Old papers covered a small desk inside. Boxes stacked against the walls beneath layers of dust. The air smelled faintly of cedar and age. Then Aurielle saw the portrait leaning against the far shelf. Her breath stopped. It was the same child from the charcoal sketch in Lucien's study. Only this painting was larger and fully colored. The little girl wore pale blue velvet trimmed with silver stitching. A crescent-shaped pendant rested against her throat. Her eyes looked directly toward the painter with strange calm confidence. Aurielle moved closer without realizing it. Beneath the portrait rested a brass plaque covered partly by dust. She brushed it clean carefully with trembling fingers. Lady Aurelia Ashbourne, winter of 1809. Aurielle stared at the name. Aurelia, not Aurielle. Close enough to make cold spread slowly through her entire body. A floorboard creaked suddenly behind her. Aurielle turned immediately. Lucien Ravensshire stood in the doorway watching her. Neither of them spoke. Firelight from the corridor moved softly across his face. revealing an expression emptier than anger and heavier than surprise. His eyes shifted from the portrait to her face with devastating certainty. Aurielle's voice came quietly. "Who is she?" Lucien closed the distance between them slowly until he stood beside the old portrait. "A child this house failed to protect." Aurielle looked back toward the painting again. The resemblance frightened her now. Not because it existed, because she could no longer pretend not to see it. "Why does she look like me?" she whispered. Lucien answered without hesitation. "Because I do not think she only looks like you." Silence filled the tiny room. Aurielle felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "No," she said automatically. "That is impossible." "I thought so too." His voice remained painfully calm. "Until you walked into Blackmere Hall carrying the exact mark recorded in Ashbourne family records 18 years ago. Aurielle shook her head once. "My mother would have told me." Lucien looked at her carefully. "Would she?" The question landed harder than accusation. Aurielle opened her mouth to answer but stopped. Fragments of memory flickered again behind her eyes. Candlelight, music, velvet curtains moving near tall windows. A woman's voice singing softly while snow touched the glass outside. Not Dunmere Village. Not the fishing cottage where she grew up. Something older, richer, forgotten. Aurielle stepped backward instinctively. "I do not understand any of this." Lucien's gaze softened for the first time since she met him. "Barely. Neither did I at first." She looked toward him sharply. "You knew about me before now." A long silence followed. Then he answered truthfully. "I knew about a missing child." Aurielle's breathing became shallow. "And if I am her?" Lucien's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "Then everyone inside this house is in far greater danger than they realize. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks through cracks." Aurielle did not sleep that night. Long after the winter assembly ended and the final carriage disappeared beyond the snow-covered gates of Blackmere Hall, she remained awake inside the narrow servant chamber overlooking the eastern cliffs. Moonlight spilled faintly across the floorboards through frost-covered windows while the rest of the servants slept around her in exhausted silence. She lay still beneath heavy blankets staring into darkness, hearing Lucien Ravenshire's voice repeating endlessly inside her mind. "A child this house failed to protect." The words settled deep inside her chest with unbearable weight. Every memory she trusted suddenly felt uncertain. Her mother's tired smile beside the cottage fireplace in Dunmere. The stories about her father. The tiny fishing village where she believed she belonged. None of it disappeared completely. Yet now every memory carried the unsettling feeling of something partially hidden beneath it. Near dawn, Aurielle finally rose from bed and crossed quietly toward the washstand before the other maids awakened. The water inside the basin felt freezing against her fingertips. She rolled back her sleeve slowly and stared at the crescent-shaped birthmark near her wrist. She had never questioned it before. It had simply existed. A small strange shape on her skin no different than freckles or scars. Now the mark felt heavier somehow, as though the tiny pale curve carried an entire history no one had told her. A knock sounded softly against the servant's door behind her. Aurielle turned immediately. Polly, one of the younger kitchen maids, opened the door several inches with nervous hesitation. "Mrs. Hollowmere wants you upstairs," she whispered. "Now?" "The Duke requested breakfast in the east study." Polly shifted awkwardly. "And he asked for you specifically." Aurielle stared for half a second before lowering her sleeve again. "Thank you." The younger girl lingered near the doorway. "People are talking about you downstairs." Aurielle looked toward her quietly. Polly swallowed once. "Some say you're going to become the Duke's personal servant." "That is ridiculous." "I know." Polly hesitated again. "But Lord Cedric asked about you twice before leaving last night." Unease moved through Aurielle instantly. "What did he ask?" "Only where you came from." Polly lowered her voice further. Mrs. Hollowmere looked furious afterward. Aurielle nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Polly gave a quick, nervous smile before disappearing down the corridor again. By 7 o'clock, Aurielle crossed the eastern galleries carrying a silver breakfast tray toward Lucien's study. Morning light stretched pale and cold through the tall manor windows. Snow continued drifting lightly across the cliffs beyond the estate. Blackmere Hall felt strangely hollow after the previous night's gathering. Quiet again. Watching again. Aurielle paused briefly outside the study doors before entering. Lucien stood near the south window, already dressed for the day in a dark navy coat over black trousers and polished boots. A leather folder rested open across the desk behind him. He looked as though he had not slept at all. "Your breakfast, your grace," Aurielle said softly. Lucien turned toward her. "Set it down." She obeyed immediately, arranging the tray near the fireplace table. Coffee, toast, fresh fruit imported from London. The Duke rarely ate heavily during mornings, according to the servants downstairs. Lucien watched her silently while she worked. The silence between them no longer felt ordinary. Too much had changed overnight. Finally he spoke. "Did you sleep?" Aurielle hesitated slightly at the unexpected question. "Not very well, sir." "Understandable." She adjusted the coffee cup carefully before forcing herself to ask what had haunted her all night. "How long have you known about the Ashbourne child?" Lucien remained quiet several seconds before answering. "Since I was 16. Aurielle looked toward him despite herself. 16. "My father showed me the records shortly before he died." His expression remained controlled, but something colder moved beneath the surface now. Old resentment, perhaps. "He told me one child survived the Ashbourne fire and vanished before dawn." Aurielle frowned faintly. "Why would your father know that?" Lucien's eyes shifted toward the snow outside the window. "Because the Ravenshiers were responsible for protecting the Ashbournes." The answer unsettled her immediately. Protecting them from what? He looked back toward her slowly. "Other noble families." Aurielle stared at him. Families needed protection from each other? Power creates fear. His voice remained calm. Fear creates enemies. She fell silent after that. The world he described felt impossibly distant from the fishing villages where she believed she grew up. Yet deep inside herself, another feeling whispered quietly now. Recognition. Not complete, not conscious, but present all the same. Lucien crossed toward the desk and opened the leather folder resting there. "Come here." Aurielle obeyed cautiously. Several old documents covered the desk beside faded maps and newspaper clippings yellowed by age. One page contained a detailed sketch of the Ashbourne crest, a silver crescent moon above a winter rose. Another showed newspaper headlines discussing the destruction of Ashbourne Manor 18 years earlier. Fire claims northern estate. Entire household lost. Aurielle's eyes moved lower across the page until one line stopped her breath. No survivors recovered from children's East Wing. Her fingers tightened unconsciously at her sides. "They believed the child died," Lucien said quietly. "Officially, yes. But you never believed it." His gaze lowered briefly toward the crescent hidden beneath her sleeve. "No," Aurielle forced herself to keep breathing steadily. "Why?" Lucien answered immediately. "Because no body was ever found." Silence settled across the study again. Firelight flickered softly against the dark shelves while distant wind brushed against the windows. Aurielle looked down at the newspaper clipping once more. Something about the words disturbed her beyond simple fear. A strange ache moved through her chest as though some forgotten part of herself recognized the tragedy before her mind could understand it. Then another detail caught her attention. A date, December 20th, 1809. Aurielle blinked slowly. "That was 6 days after my birthday." Lucien watched her carefully. "Yes. And the child disappeared that same night?" "Yes." Aurielle stepped backward slightly from the desk. "No," she shook her head once. "This still proves nothing." Lucien remained silent. "There must be hundreds of girls born with marks like this." "Perhaps. And names can resemble each other by coincidence." "Perhaps." Frustration slipped briefly into her voice. "Then why are you looking at me as though you already know?" Lucien's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Not certainty. Something more dangerous than certainty." Conviction. Because you remember things you should not remember. Aurielle froze. The song in the music room, he continued quietly. The eastern corridors. The scent of cedar smoke. He stepped closer slowly. You reacted to places you have never seen before. Her heartbeat became uneven again. That could mean anything. Could it? The room felt smaller suddenly. Warmer. Aurielle looked away first. Even if what you say is true, she whispered. Why would anyone hide a child for 18 years? Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. Because dead heirs cannot inherit estates. The answer landed with terrifying clarity. Aurielle stared at him. You think someone wanted the Ashbourne family gone? I know they did. Before she could respond, rapid footsteps echoed suddenly outside the study doors. A second later, Mrs. Hollowmere entered without waiting for permission, her face unusually pale beneath perfect composure. Your Grace. Lucien turned sharply. What is it? The housekeeper's eyes flickered once toward Aurielle before returning to the Duke. A messenger arrived from London 20 minutes ago. She swallowed carefully. Lord Cedric Vale requested immediate access to the Ashbourne archives. The silence that followed felt dangerous enough to shatter. Lucien's expression hardened instantly into something colder than anger. On whose authority? Lady Seraphine's. Aurielle felt the air leave her lungs. Lucien closed the leather folder at once. No one enters the archives without my permission. Mrs. Hollowmere hesitated only briefly. Lord Cedric already left for the lower records chamber. Lucien moved immediately toward the door. Aurielle stepped aside instinctively as he passed her. Then he stopped suddenly and looked back. Stay inside the east wing until I return. Your Grace, I do not understand what is happening. His gray eyes held hers for one heavy second. Neither do the people trying to erase you. Then he disappeared down the corridor with Mrs. Hollowmere following behind, leaving Aurielle alone beside the old Ashbourne records while the first real fear settled quietly into her bones. Fear changes shape when it finally becomes personal. Aurielle remained inside the Duke's study long after Lucien left. The room felt colder now despite the fire still burning steadily beside the hearth. Snow drifted beyond the tall windows overlooking the cliffs while silence settled heavily across the eastern wing. She stood motionless near the desk staring at the old Ashbourne records spread beneath the candlelight. The papers no longer looked like distant history. They looked dangerous. Slowly, Aurielle lowered herself into the chair beside the desk and looked again at the faded newspaper clipping describing the fire 18 years ago. The words blurred slightly before her eyes. Entire household lost. No survivors recovered from children's East Wing. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She did not know those people. She should not feel grief for strangers dead nearly 2 decades. Yet sorrow moved through her all the same. Deep, strange, familiar. Her fingertips brushed lightly across the edge of the paper. Another memory surfaced without warning. Warm candlelight. Someone laughing softly nearby. A woman's voice saying, "Do not run near the stairs, Aurelia." Aurielle froze. The memory vanished almost immediately afterward, leaving only silence behind. Aurelia, not Aurielle. The name echoed painfully inside her mind. A sharp knock against the study door startled her upright. Aurielle quickly gathered the scattered documents into proper order before speaking. Come in. Mrs. Hollowmere entered carrying folded linens against one arm. The older woman stopped immediately upon noticing the records still spread across the desk. Her face tightened slightly. You should not remain here alone, she said quietly. Aurielle looked toward her carefully. Did they find Lord Cedric? Mrs. Hollowmere crossed slowly into the room before answering. Yes. What happened? The housekeeper hesitated. His Grace escorted him out of the archives personally. Aurielle noticed the tension beneath the older woman's controlled voice. Were they arguing? The Duke does not argue. Mrs. Hollowmere began replacing fresh towels near the fireplace with mechanical precision. He informs people when they have crossed boundaries. Aurielle lowered her eyes briefly toward the Ashbourne records again. Why is everyone afraid of these documents? The older woman stopped moving. Silence stretched between them several seconds. Finally she spoke without turning around. Because old names still carry power. Even after 18 years? Mrs. Hollowmere looked toward her at last. Especially after 18 years. Aurielle searched the woman's expression carefully. You already knew about me, did you not? A faint shadow crossed the housekeeper's face. No, but you suspected. Another silence followed. Mrs. Hollowmere folded the towel in her hands once before setting it aside. When you first arrived at Blackmere Hall 2 years ago, I noticed the mark immediately. Aurielle's pulse quickened. Why did you never say anything? Because silence keeps people alive. The answer came too quickly to be casual. Aurielle stood slowly from the desk chair. Alive from whom? Mrs. Hollowmere's eyes shifted toward the closed study doors instinctively before returning to her face. Some truths attract dangerous attention. Lord Cedric. Not only him. Aurielle frowned softly. Then who? The older woman stepped closer now, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. There are families in England who would destroy entire bloodlines to protect inheritance. Aurielle stared at her. That cannot be true. Mrs. Hollowmere's expression did not change. You were raised far from noble houses, Miss Whitford. Be grateful for that. The words unsettled her more than any threat could have. My mother never mentioned any of this. Your mother was wiser than most aristocrats I have known. Aurielle's breath caught slightly. You knew her? Another pause. Too long. Mrs. Hollowmere looked away first. Only briefly. Aurielle stepped closer instinctively. Then tell me the truth. The older woman's composure tightened immediately. I cannot. Why? Because promises were made. To whom? Before Mrs. Hollowmere could answer, rapid footsteps echoed outside the study again. Both women turned sharply toward the door just as it opened. Lucien entered first. Snow dusted lightly across the shoulders of his dark coat. His expression looked colder than before. Behind him stood Cedric Vale. The atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Cedric's charming smile remained in place, but tension sharpened beneath it now like a blade hidden beneath silk. There she is, he said lightly. Aurielle stiffened unconsciously. Lucien closed the study doors behind them with controlled force. Lord Cedric insisted upon apologizing personally. Cedric spread one hand casually. Apparently searching private archives without permission offends Blackmere hospitality. His eyes moved toward Aurielle again. Though, in my defense, curiosity can become difficult to resist. Aurielle lowered her gaze immediately. I do not understand what this has to do with me, sir. Cedric laughed softly. Do you not? Lucien stepped between them before the younger man could continue. Enough. Cedric's expression cooled slightly. You are becoming remarkably protective over a servant, Lucien. Silence settled heavily across the room. Aurielle felt it immediately. The danger beneath Cedric's smile. The warning beneath Lucien's stillness. Cedric looked toward the Ashbourne papers resting on the desk. Interesting reading material. Lucien's voice lowered. Leave. Cedric did not move. You know what happens if society hears whispers about surviving heirs. I said leave. Cedric studied him another moment before finally sighing. Very well. He adjusted his gloves slowly before turning toward the door. Then he paused beside Aurielle. One piece of advice, Miss Whitford. She remained perfectly still. Cedric's voice softened slightly. Do not trust noble families too easily. They survive by rewriting history. He left immediately afterward. The study doors closed behind him with quiet finality. Lucien remained motionless near the fireplace several seconds after Cedric disappeared. Mrs. Hollowmere quietly excused herself soon afterward, leaving Aurielle alone with the Duke once more. The silence between them felt different now, less uncertain, more dangerous. Aurielle finally spoke first. He knows. Lucien looked toward the fire. He suspects. Is there a difference? Yes. His answer came immediately. Aurielle crossed slowly toward the window overlooking the frozen cliffs. You said someone tried to erase me. Lucien watched her carefully now. Yes. Who? He remained silent long enough for her to understand the truth before he spoke it aloud. I do not know. Aurielle turned sharply. Then how can you be certain? Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. Because the Ashbourne fire was not an accident. The room became very still. Aurielle stared at him. You believe someone started it deliberately. I know they did. Her heartbeat quickened painfully. How? Lucien crossed toward the desk and opened another section of the leather file. Inside rested a folded letter sealed with faded black wax. He handed it to her carefully. My father wrote this the night before he died. Aurielle unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting appeared elegant but rushed in places as though written under pressure. If anything happens to the Ashbourne child, trust no one beyond Blackmere. The Vale family must never gain control of northern inheritance claims. Aurielle looked up immediately. The Valles? Lucien nodded once. Seraphine's family. Cold spread through Aurielle's chest. You think they were involved? I think my father feared they were. She lowered her eyes toward the letter again. Another line caught her attention. If the child survives, she must never know her identity until it is safe. Aurielle's fingers tightened around the page. Safe from what? Lucien's expression darkened. From becoming the rightful heir to one of the largest estates in northern England. Silence followed. Heavy. Immovable. Aurielle looked toward the snow beyond the windows because the room suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. Everything she believed about herself had begun collapsing piece by piece since entering Blackmere Hall. Yet somehow the most frightening part was not the possibility she belonged to another family. It was the realization that someone powerful might have spent 18 years making certain she never discovered it. Her voice came very quietly. If I really am this missing child? Lucien watched her closely. Yes. Aurielle swallowed once. Then why did my mother hide me in a fishing village? Lucien answered without hesitation. Because she wanted you alive. The words settled into silence between them. Then another memory struck Aurielle suddenly. Stronger this time. A woman kneeling before her beside a carriage at night while snow fell heavily around them. Cold hands cupping her face. A whispered sentence. You must never tell anyone your real name. Aurielle staggered slightly backward. Lucien moved instantly. His hand closed carefully around her arm before she lost balance completely. Aurielle. She stared at him in shock. I remember her. Lucien's expression sharpened immediately. Who? Her breathing became uneven. A woman in the snow. Fragments continued flashing through her mind now. Velvet seats inside a carriage. Smoke rising somewhere far away. Someone crying. She told me not to say my real name. Lucien's hand tightened slightly around her arm. What name? Aurielle looked directly into his eyes for the first time since entering Blackmere Hall. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Aurelia. Sometimes a single remembered word can destroy an entire lie. Lucien Ravensshire did not release Aurielle's arm immediately after she whispered the name. Aurelia. The sound settled heavily inside the study between them while snow drifted silently beyond the windows. Firelight moved softly across the Duke's face, revealing something she had never seen there before. Not suspicion. Not calculation. Relief. Small. Controlled. Dangerous in its intensity. Aurielle became aware of his hand still resting against her sleeve. Warm. Steady. She stepped back first. Lucien let go at once. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Aurielle turned away toward the fireplace because the room suddenly felt too close around her. The memories frightened her more now that they existed clearly enough to recognize. Before tonight, uncertainty still allowed denial. Now denial had begun collapsing piece by piece. Aurelia. The name did not feel foreign in her mind anymore. Felt buried. Hidden beneath years of silence and survival until Blackmere Hall forced it back into the light. Lucien closed the leather file slowly before speaking. Did your mother ever call you that name directly? Aurielle pressed trembling fingers lightly against the edge of the fireplace mantel. I do not know. Her voice sounded distant even to herself. I remember hearing it only once. During the carriage memory? She nodded faintly. The woman sounded frightened. Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As she should have been. Aurielle looked toward him sharply. You truly believe someone tried to kill a child over inheritance? I believe powerful families have destroyed far more for less. Silence followed again. Aurielle wished he sounded uncertain. Instead, his calm certainty frightened her more than open fear would have. A knock interrupted the room before she could answer. Mrs. Hollowmere entered carrying a fresh stack of correspondence sealed with wax. The older woman stopped immediately upon noticing the atmosphere inside the study. Her eyes moved once toward Aurielle's pale face before returning to the Duke. Your Grace. Lucien accepted the letters without comment. Mrs. Hollowmere hesitated briefly. Lady Seraphine requests your presence in the West drawing room. For what purpose? She says the matter concerns family alliances. Lucien's expression cooled instantly. Of course it does. The housekeeper lingered another second before quietly adding, Lord Cedric has not yet left the estate. Why? She whispered. Why continue searching after so long? Lucien moved toward the window overlooking the frozen cliffs before answering. Because my father died believing he failed her. Aurielle watched the rigid line of his shoulders. And you inherited that responsibility. Yes. Even though you had never met the child. His voice lowered slightly. Some responsibilities do not require personal attachment. The answer should have sounded cold. Instead it carried something heavier beneath it. Something she could not fully name. Aurielle lowered her gaze again before speaking quietly. You talk about her as though she mattered. Lucien remained silent several seconds. Then he answered without turning around. She did. The simplicity of the statement tightened unexpectedly around Aurielle's chest. She did not understand why. Midday arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Blackmere Hall remained quieter than usual after the winter assembly, though servants still moved continuously through the estate cleaning guest chambers and restoring order after the previous evening's gathering. Aurielle spent most of the afternoon inside the east wing organizing bookshelves and replacing linens exactly as instructed. Yet concentration became impossible. Everywhere she looked, fragments of memory continued surfacing unexpectedly. A silver music box melody. A staircase lined with winter roses. Small hands holding hers beside candlelight. The memories never remained long enough to fully grasp. They appeared like reflections in broken glass before disappearing again. By late afternoon, Aurielle carried fresh towels toward the unused eastern nursery corridor near the top floor. Few servants entered that section of Blackmere Hall anymore. Dust covered most of the furniture beneath white linen sheets while portraits remained turned toward walls as though someone had deliberately hidden the past from sight. Aurielle paused outside one closed nursery door without understanding why. Her heartbeat quickened slowly. The corridor smelled faintly of cedar smoke again. Familiar. The feeling unsettled her immediately. She should have continued walking. Instead, her hand lifted toward the brass doorknob almost without permission. The door opened quietly beneath her touch. Sunlight filtered weakly through lace curtains inside the room. Dust floated through pale beams of light above a faded blue carpet scattered with abandoned wooden toys. A child's rocking horse rested near the fireplace beneath layers of white cloth. Aurielle stepped slowly inside. The room felt frozen in time, as though someone closed the door years ago and never returned. Her eyes moved toward the far wall. Small pencil markings covered the wood beside the window frame. Height measurements. Dates. A child growing year by year. Aurielle crossed closer instinctively. One name repeated beside each mark in elegant handwriting. Aurelia. Her breath became uneven again. The highest mark stopped abruptly at age 5. December 1809. Aurielle touched the faded pencil line lightly with trembling fingertips. Another memory struck without warning. Stronger than before. She stood beside this exact window wearing pale blue velvet while snow fell outside the glass. A woman brushed curls away from her face while laughing softly. Stand still, Aurelia. Your father wishes to measure you properly. Aurielle staggered backward sharply. The room blurred around her for one terrifying second. She gripped the window frame to steady herself. "Miss Whitford." Aurielle turned immediately. Lucien stood in the doorway watching her carefully. He looked from her pale expression toward the height markings on the wall. Understanding crossed his face instantly. "You remembered something." It was not a question. Aurielle pressed one trembling hand against her chest. "This room." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I know this room." Lucien entered slowly. Dust shifted beneath his boots across the faded carpet. "Tell me." Aurielle closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself to hold onto the memory before it disappeared again. "There was a woman here." "Your mother." "No," she shook her head faintly. "Someone younger. Dark hair. She laughed when I would not stand still near the window." Lucien's expression tightened slightly. "Lady Evelyn Ashbourne." Aurielle opened her eyes again. "Who was she?" "Your mother." Silence swallowed the nursery completely. Aurielle stared at him in shock. "No, Aurielle." "No," she stepped backward again instinctively. "You cannot know that." Lucien moved no closer. "The nursery belonged to Evelyn Ashbourne's daughter." His voice remained calm. "Only one child lived here." Aurielle's breathing became shallow. She looked around the room desperately now. The rocking horse, the faded toys, the winter blue curtains. Everything felt impossibly familiar and impossibly distant at the same time. "Why can I remember this place?" she whispered. Lucien answered softly. "Because memory survives longer than fear." Tears threatened unexpectedly behind her eyes. Not grief exactly. Overwhelm. The terrifying feeling of an entire identity beginning to crack open beneath her feet. She turned away sharply before he could see it. "I need air." Lucien's voice followed quietly behind her. "Aurielle." She stopped near the doorway without turning around. "If I truly belonged here," she said softly, "then why does it feel like someone stole my entire life?" Lucien looked toward the faded nursery walls before answering. "Because someone did." The words settled heavily into silence. Then another voice echoed suddenly from the corridor outside. "How touching!" Both of them turned immediately. Lady Seraphine stood beyond the doorway wearing a dark burgundy afternoon gown trimmed with black lace gloves. Her expression looked perfectly composed. Only her eyes betrayed the tension beneath it. She looked from Lucien to Aurielle slowly before smiling faintly. "You should be careful reopening old rooms," she said quietly. "Some memories are dangerous." Lucien's expression hardened at once. "What are you doing here?" Seraphine ignored the question entirely. Her gaze remained fixed on Aurielle now with unsettling calm. "Tell me, Miss Whitford." She stepped one pace closer into the corridor light. "When you remember the fire, do you also remember who carried you away from it?" The nursery became completely still. Aurielle felt her pulse stop for one terrible second, because somewhere deep beneath the fragments of memory and forgotten names, another image suddenly began rising slowly toward the surface. A woman wearing black gloves, the scent of roses and smoke, and eyes exactly the same shade as Seraphine Vale's. The past becomes most dangerous the moment it begins recognizing you back. The nursery corridor fell silent after Seraphine's question. Aurielle could hear only the distant howl of winter wind against the manor windows and the uneven rhythm of her own breathing. The image inside her mind sharpened painfully now. Black gloves, smoke, the scent of roses, a woman carrying her through darkness while flames reflected against polished hallway mirrors. Seraphine's eyes never left her face. "You remember something," she said softly. Lucien stepped forward immediately, placing himself partly between them. "Enough." Seraphine's expression remained composed. "You cannot protect her from memory, Lucien." Aurielle pressed one trembling hand against the nursery wall. The room suddenly felt unstable around her. "I do not understand," she whispered. Seraphine tilted her head slightly. "No, not yet." Lucien's voice turned colder. "Leave the East Wing." "Or what?" For the first time since meeting the Duke, Aurielle saw genuine anger move beneath his restraint. Quiet anger, the dangerous kind. Do not test me today, Seraphine. The woman studied him carefully for several seconds before smiling faintly again. You sound exactly like your father. The statement landed sharply between them. Lucien's expression darkened further. Seraphine finally looked toward Aurielle once more. Some people inside this house are not telling you the full story. Her voice softened almost sympathetically. Be careful who you trust. Then she turned and disappeared down the corridor without another word. Silence returned immediately afterward. Aurielle stared at the empty doorway where Seraphine vanished moments earlier. Her pulse still raced painfully beneath her skin. Lucien remained motionless beside her for several seconds before speaking quietly. Look at me. Aurielle forced herself to turn toward him. What did you remember? The answer came slowly, unevenly. A woman carrying me through smoke. Lucien watched her closely. And I could not see her face clearly. Aurielle swallowed hard. Only her gloves. Black gloves. She nodded faintly. And roses. Lucien looked away briefly toward the snow-covered windows. Aurielle noticed the tension in his jaw immediately. You know what that means. It was not a question. He remained silent too long. Lucien. The use of his first name slipped out before she realized it. The room became still again. Aurielle lowered her eyes instantly. I apologize, Your Grace. But Lucien did not react the way she expected. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Softer for one brief moment before discipline returned again. Seraphine always wore black gloves, he said quietly. Aurielle felt cold spread slowly through her chest. You think she was there that night? I think she knows more than she admits. Aurielle looked toward the faded nursery walls again. Why would she save me if her family wanted the Ashbournes gone? Lucien answered carefully. That is the part one do not understand. Another memory flickered suddenly through Aurielle's mind. A carriage door slamming shut. Snow falling heavily across dark trees. Someone crying beside her. She closed her eyes tightly against the sharp ache behind them. Lucien noticed immediately. Another memory? Only pieces. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to steady it. Everything feels broken apart. Lucien stepped closer but stopped before touching her again. Memory returns slowly after trauma. Aurielle laughed softly once beneath her breath. The sound carried no humor. You speak as though this has happened before. It has. She looked toward him sharply. To you. His expression shuddered instantly. No, the answer ended the conversation before it could continue. Aurielle recognized the wall in his voice immediately. Everyone inside Blackmere Hall carried ghosts. Lucien simply carried his more quietly than most. Evening settled early over the manor beneath heavy gray skies. Snowfall thickened again across the cliffs while servants lit fireplaces throughout the estate one by one. Aurielle spent the remainder of the afternoon unable to focus on her duties. Every corridor inside Blackmere now triggered fragments of memory she could not fully control. A staircase, a melody, a scent, small pieces of another life rising slowly toward the surface. By dinner hour, she found herself back near the Eastern music room almost without realizing how she arrived there. The hallway stood empty. Firelight flickered softly against the dark wood walls while distant conversation drifted faintly from the lower drawing rooms. Aurielle stopped outside the piano room door. The same strange familiarity tightened quietly around her chest. Then music began inside. Soft piano notes. The same lullaby Lucien played days earlier. Aurielle pushed the door open slowly. Lucien sat alone beside the grand piano beneath low candlelight. His coat rested discarded across one chair while snow moved faintly beyond the tall windows behind him. He did not look up immediately when she entered. His fingers continued moving across the keys with controlled precision. Aurielle stood silently near the doorway listening. The melody hurt somehow, beautiful and sad in equal measure. When the final note faded, Lucien finally spoke without turning around. You came back. Aurielle stepped farther inside. The song feels familiar. Lucien rested his hands lightly against the piano keys. Your mother used to play it every winter. Aurielle closed her eyes briefly. Another flash of memory surfaced instantly. Sitting beneath the piano while music drifted above her. Small hands clutching a stuffed rabbit. Someone laughing softly nearby. Her eyes opened again. I remember hiding under the piano. Lucien turned toward her sharply. What? A woman was playing while I sat beneath it. Aurielle touched the edge of the instrument carefully. I remember the carpet scratching my knees. Lucien stared at her with dangerous intensity now. What else? She shook her head faintly. Nothing clear. Silence stretched between them. Then Aurielle noticed something resting atop the piano beside the candle holder. A silver necklace, crescent-shaped. Her breath caught immediately. Lucien followed her gaze. It belonged to Evelyn Ashbourne. Aurielle stepped closer slowly. The necklace looked identical to the pendant from the portraits. May I? Lucien nodded once. Aurielle picked it up carefully. The silver felt strangely warm against her fingertips despite the cold room. Then another memory struck violently through her mind. Flames. Smoke. Someone fastening the necklace around her throat while whispering desperately, "Never take this off." Aurielle gasped softly and dropped the necklace back onto the piano. Lucien stood instantly. Aurielle. Her breathing became uneven. I remember the fire. The words barely rose above a whisper. Images crashed through her mind now in broken flashes. Smoke filling corridors. Servants shouting. A woman kneeling before her with tears across her face. Black gloves reaching toward her through the darkness. Someone took the necklace away, Aurielle whispered. Before the carriage. Lucien's expression sharpened immediately. Who? Aurielle pressed trembling fingers against her temple. I do not know. Another image appeared suddenly. A man arguing loudly somewhere beyond the smoke. A crest ring flashing beside firelight. Wolves engraved in silver. Aurielle looked toward Lucien in shock. There was a raven's hire there that night. Lucien went completely still. What did you say? I saw your family crest. Her voice shook harder now. Someone from Blackmere was inside Ashbourne Manor during the fire. Silence consumed the music room. The implications settled slowly between them like falling snow. Lucien's face became unreadable. Aurielle realized immediately what frightened him. If a Ravenshire stood inside Ashbourne Manor the night the fire began, then Blackmere itself might have been involved. Lucien looked away first toward the dark windows. My father told me the Ravenshyres tried to protect the Ashbournes. Aurielle tightened her grip against the piano edge. And if he lied? The question landed harder than accusation. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. He would not. Yet the certainty in his voice no longer sounded complete. Aurielle saw it immediately. Doubt. Small but real. Then sudden footsteps echoed rapidly outside the music room. Both of them turned just as Mrs. Hollowmere appeared breathless in the doorway. Panic broke through her composure for the first time since Aurielle met her. Your Grace. Lucien stepped forward instantly. What happened? The housekeeper looked directly toward Aurielle with visible alarm. Someone entered the lower archives again. Silence. Then Mrs. Hollowmere finished quietly. And the Ashbourne inheritance records are gone. When people begin destroying records, it means the truth has finally become dangerous. The Eastern music room emptied within seconds after Mrs. Hollowmere delivered the news. Lucien crossed the corridor immediately with the housekeeper beside him, while Aurielle followed several steps behind, her pulse hammering painfully against her ribs. Snow rattled softly against the manor windows as they descended the narrow eastern staircase toward the lower archives beneath Blackmere Hall. The estate had grown unnaturally quiet. Most guests from the winter assembly remained asleep in their chambers, while only a handful of servants moved through the distant corridors carrying firewood and fresh tea trays. Yet beneath the silence, tension spread through the manor like smoke. By the time they reached the lower records chamber, 2 footmen already stood outside the archive doors looking visibly uneasy. Lucien entered without speaking. Aurielle stopped in the doorway behind him. The room smelled of old paper and candle wax. Shelves stretched floor to ceiling across stone walls lined with centuries of estate records, inheritance ledgers, birth certificates, and sealed legal documents belonging to northern noble families. One cabinet near the rear wall stood open. Empty folders littered the desk beside it. Lucian's expression hardened instantly. Which files were taken? Mrs. Hollowmere stepped toward the scattered papers with trembling restraint. Ashbourne inheritance claims, birth records, land succession documents. Aurielle noticed one folder still lying half open near the edge of the desk. Lucian picked it up immediately. Empty. Only a faded label remained. Aurelia Ashbourne. The sight made cold spread through Aurielle's chest. Lucian looked toward the footmen. Who entered this room tonight? No one, Your Grace. One man answered nervously. The corridor remained empty all evening. Lucian's gaze sharpened dangerously. Then explain the missing records. Neither servant spoke again. Mrs. Hollowmere quietly dismissed them moments later, leaving only the three of them inside the archive chamber. Aurielle moved slowly toward the open cabinet. Dust still lingered along the wooden shelves except for one clean space where the files had clearly been removed recently. Someone knew exactly what they were searching for. Lord Cedric, Aurielle whispered. Lucian remained silent beside the desk. Perhaps, he finally answered. Or Seraphine. Aurielle turned toward him sharply. You believe she ordered this? I believe the Valets are trying to erase evidence before confirmation becomes official. Official? Lucian opened another ledger lying across the table. If the Ashbourne heir still lives, every inheritance agreement signed after the fire becomes vulnerable to legal challenge. Aurielle struggled to fully understand the implications. Meaning? Lucian looked directly at her. Meaning someone gained enormous wealth after the Ashbourne family disappeared. Silence settled heavily inside the archive chamber. Aurielle glanced again toward the empty shelf where her records once existed. Her records. The thought alone still felt impossible. And if those papers vanish completely? She asked quietly. Lucian's expression remained cold. Then proving your identity becomes significantly harder. Aurielle lowered her gaze. Fear moved deeper through her now. Not only fear for herself. Fear of becoming trapped between families powerful enough to erase entire histories. Mrs. Hollowmere suddenly spoke from near the rear shelves. Your Grace. Lucian crossed toward her immediately. Aurielle followed. The older woman held a single folded page she apparently discovered beneath the cabinet. One corner looked torn as though someone dropped it while searching in haste. Lucian accepted the paper carefully and unfolded it beneath the candlelight. Aurielle saw his expression change almost imperceptibly. What is it? She asked. Lucian handed her the document without answering. Aurielle looked down slowly. The page contained a private correspondence dated 18 years earlier. Several lines had faded with age, but one sentence remained painfully clear. If the child survives, Blackmere must never discover where she is taken. Aurielle stared at the words. Taken where? Lucian's jaw tightened faintly. The rest is missing. Mrs. Hollowmere looked visibly pale now. Someone removed the final pages deliberately. Aurielle continued reading. Another sentence farther below caught her attention. The northern inheritance will pass permanently to the Vale Alliance once the Ashbourne line is declared extinct. Her breathing slowed painfully. The Valets inherited Ashbourne property. Lucian answered immediately. Partially. Then Seraphine lied. Yes. The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Aurielle looked toward him carefully. Did your father know? Lucian remained quiet several seconds before answering. I believe he suspected. But he never stopped them. The question escaped before she could soften it. Silence followed. Lucian looked away first toward the shadowed shelves lining the archive walls. By the time he understood the extent of it, the Ashbourne fire had already happened. Something in his expression stopped Aurielle from speaking further. Guilt, old and deeply buried. The kind passed from one generation to another until no one remembered where it began. A sudden noise echoed faintly above them. Footsteps. Lucian reacted instantly. Stay here. He moved toward the staircase without hesitation. Aurielle followed anyway despite the command. Mrs. Hollowmere called after them softly, but neither stopped. The upper eastern corridor stood empty when they emerged from the archive stairs. Candlelight flickered against dark wood walls while snow battered the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. Another sound echoed somewhere deeper inside the manor. A door closing quickly. Lucien crossed the corridor at once toward the west gallery. Aurielle struggled to keep pace behind him. They turned the corner sharply near the upper drawing-room corridor just in time to glimpse movement disappearing beyond the eastern staircase. A dark figure. Black coat. Fast. Lucien descended the stairs immediately. Aurielle followed despite the dangerous speed. The figure vanished again near the lower gallery before finally stopping at the entrance hall doors. Cedric Vale turned slowly beneath the chandelier light. Snow drifted through the partially opened front entrance behind him. He looked almost amused to find them there. Lucien. His calmness felt unnatural. Lucien stopped several feet away. Leaving early? Cedric adjusted his gloves casually. I suddenly remembered business in London. Lucien's eyes lowered briefly toward the leather satchel in Cedric's hand. Search his belongings, he ordered the nearby footmen. Cedric laughed softly. Careful. Open the bag. Or what? Lucien stepped closer. The atmosphere inside the entrance hall shifted instantly. Every servant nearby became completely motionless. You entered my archives without permission, Lucien said quietly. You stole private estate records. Cedric's smile faded slightly. You cannot prove that. Open the bag. For one long second neither man moved. Then Cedric handed the satchel toward the footman himself with visible irritation. The servant searched it quickly beneath the chandelier light. Clothing, documents, whiskey flask, nothing else. No Ashbourne records. Lucien's expression darkened further. Cedric took back the satchel calmly. Satisfied? Aurielle watched carefully from the staircase landing above. Something felt wrong. Too easy. Cedric looked upward suddenly and met her eyes directly across the entrance hall. You should ask him about the Ravenshire's before trusting them completely, he said softly. Lucien's voice cut through the room like ice. Leave Blackmere. Cedric smiled faintly again. Gladly. He turned toward the open doors where snow and darkness waited beyond the estate. Then he paused one final time. One more thing, Lucien. Lucien did not answer. Cedric glanced back toward Aurielle. The girl remembers more than you think. Then he disappeared into the storm outside. Silence consumed the entrance hall after the doors closed behind him. Aurielle slowly descended the remaining staircase steps. Lucien remained motionless near the entrance, staring toward the snow beyond the glass doors. He took the records, Aurielle said quietly. Yes, but not with him. Lucien looked toward her at last. No unease settled immediately through her chest. Then where are they? Before Lucien could answer, another voice entered softly from the shadows near the west corridor. Perhaps I can help with that. Both of them turned immediately. Seraphine Vale stepped into the chandelier light wearing a dark silk dressing gown over her evening attire, as though she had been awake waiting for this exact moment. Her expression remained calm. Too calm. She looked toward Aurielle with unsettling gentleness. You deserve to know the truth. Lucien's face hardened instantly. Do not play games tonight, Seraphine. She ignored him completely. Her eyes never left Aurielle. The records were removed because someone inside Blackmere has been lying to you from the beginning. Aurielle felt the air tighten painfully around her. What are you talking about? Seraphine stepped closer slowly. You keep asking who carried you away from the fire. Silence filled the hall. Seraphine's voice lowered almost to a whisper. It was not a veil. Aurielle stared at her. Then who? Seraphine looked directly toward Lucien Ravensshire before answering. It was his father. The cruelest betrayals are often committed by the people trying to save you. Silence spread through the entrance hall after Seraphine's words. Snow swirled violently beyond the tall glass doors while chandelier light reflected across the marble floors of Blackmere Hall. Aurielle stood frozen near the staircase, unable to breathe properly for one terrible second. It was his father. The sentence echoed painfully inside her mind. Lucien's expression became unreadable, completely still. Seraphine watched him carefully before turning toward Aurielle again. You deserve honesty after everything that has been hidden from you. Lucien's voice cut sharply through the hall. Enough. Seraphine ignored him. The night Ashbourne Manor burned, your father did not vanish by accident. Aurielle's eyes moved slowly toward Lucien. Is that true? He remained silent. That frightened her more than denial would have. Lucien. Her voice trembled slightly now. Tell me. He finally looked at her. My father removed you from the estate before the fire spread. Aurielle felt cold settle deep into her chest. Why? Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. Because he believed someone intended to kill every remaining Ashbourne heir. Seraphine laughed softly beneath her breath. That is the version he told his son. Lucien stepped toward her instantly. Be careful. Or what? Seraphine's composure sharpened now beneath the chandelier light. You still refuse to admit what truly happened 18 years ago. Aurielle looked between them in growing confusion. What are you talking about? Seraphine's eyes softened unexpectedly as they settled on Aurielle's face. Your mother trusted the Ravenshiers. Her voice lowered quietly. That trust destroyed her. The statement struck like ice water. Aurielle stared at her. No, Lucien answered immediately. She is lying. Am I? Seraphine folded her hands calmly before her. Then explain why your father hid the child instead of revealing her survival. Lucien said nothing. Seraphine continued. Explain why he erased her identity completely. Aurielle's breathing became shallow again. Erased. Seraphine nodded slowly. You were not hidden only for protection. Her eyes darkened slightly. You were hidden because your existence threatened powerful people, including Blackmere itself. Lucien's voice dropped dangerously low. You are manipulating half-truths. No, Seraphine looked directly at him now. I am simply less sentimental about your father's decisions than you are. Silence swallowed the entrance hall once more. Aurielle could hear only the storm outside and the faint ticking of the massive grandfather clock near the western staircase. Her thoughts had become tangled beyond reason. Lucien's father saved her, hid her, erased her identity. None of it fit together cleanly anymore. Why would he hide me from Blackmere? She whispered. Seraphine answered first. Because once the Ashbourne line disappeared officially, the Ravenshiers gained control over northern trade routes tied to Ashbourne lands. Lucien's eyes flashed coldly. Temporary control. Still profitable control. Aurielle looked toward him slowly. Is that true? Lucien held her gaze several seconds before answering. Partially. The honesty hurt more than lies would have. Aurielle stepped backward instinctively. So Blackmere benefited from my disappearance. Not intentionally. Seraphine's smile returned faintly. Intentions become very flexible when estates are involved. Lucien moved toward Aurielle immediately. Listen to me. She looked at him carefully. Should I? The question landed harder than accusation. Something shifted briefly in his expression then. Not anger. Pain. Quiet and quickly buried. My father believed keeping you hidden was the only way to keep you alive, he said calmly. And you? Aurielle asked softly. What do you believe now? Lucien answered without hesitation. That someone is trying to finish what began 18 years ago. The certainty in his voice unsettled her deeply because part of her already believed him. Yet another part could no longer ignore the possibility that every family inside Blackmere Hall carried guilt connected to her stolen life. Seraphine watched the exchange carefully before speaking again. There is more. Lucien turned sharply toward her. You have said enough. No, Seraphine's composure cracked slightly for the first time. She deserves all of it. Aurielle felt her pulse quicken painfully. All of what? Seraphine looked toward the storm outside before answering quietly. Your mother was supposed to marry into the Vale family before she chose an Ashbourne instead. Silence. What? Aurielle whispered. Seraphine's eyes returned to her face. Evelyn Ashbourne was once engaged to my older brother. Lucien closed his eyes briefly as though he already knew where this conversation would lead. Seraphine continued anyway. When she broke the engagement, northern inheritance agreements changed completely. The Ashbourne estate remained independent. The Valles lost access to trade routes worth millions over the next generation. Aurielle struggled to process the implications. You think this was revenge? I think powerful men rarely forgive humiliation. Lucien's expression hardened. You are accusing your own family. Seraphine smiled sadly now. You still believe families protect each other. The statement carried enough bitterness to quiet the room completely. Aurielle looked toward her carefully for the first time. Then why are you telling me this now? Seraphine remained silent several seconds before answering. Because some sins should not survive another generation. Something about the exhaustion in her voice sounded genuine. That frightened Aurielle more than manipulation. Lucien stepped forward again. You are still withholding information. Seraphine looked at him calmly. Yes. Why? Because not every truth belongs in hallways at midnight. Another long silence followed. Then Seraphine reached slowly inside her sleeve and removed a small silver key attached to a black ribbon. She held it toward Aurielle. What is this? Aurielle asked cautiously. The East Tower Observatory. Lucien's expression sharpened immediately. Seraphine, your father locked it after the fire, she said quietly to him without looking away from Aurielle. No one has entered since. Aurielle hesitated before accepting the key. The silver felt cold against her fingertips. Why give this to me? Seraphine's eyes darkened slightly. Because some memories were hidden there intentionally. Lucien stepped closer instantly. You do not know what is inside. Neither do you. Seraphine lowered her voice. But your father visited that room every winter until the day he died. Silence fell again, heavy and uncertain. Aurielle stared down at the small silver key resting in her hand. Somehow it felt heavier than metal should. If there are answers there, she whispered. Why did no one tell me sooner? Seraphine looked toward Lucien before answering softly. Because the truth changes people. Then she turned and disappeared down the western corridor before either of them could stop her. The entrance hall grew silent once more after she left. Aurielle remained staring at the key, while snow battered the windows beyond the estate doors. Lucien stood several feet away now, watching her with unreadable restraint. Do you trust her? Aurielle asked quietly. He answered honestly. No. But you think the observatory matters? Yes. Aurielle closed her fingers slowly around the silver key. Then I want to see it. Lucien studied her another moment before nodding once. Not tonight. Why? His eyes shifted briefly toward the darkened upper corridors of Blackmere Hall. Because if Seraphine suddenly wants you to discover something, I need to understand why first. Aurielle frowned faintly. You think it is a trap. I think every person connected to the Ashbourne fire has spent 18 years protecting themselves. The statement settled heavily between them. Aurielle looked down at the key again. And what about you? Lucien's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. What about me? What are you protecting? Silence answered first. Then he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You. The simplicity of the word unsettled something deep inside her chest. Lucien looked away immediately afterward as though the admission escaped before he intended it to. Then another memory surfaced suddenly through Aurielle's mind. A man kneeling before her beside firelight long ago. Gray eyes. A raven's hire crest ring. A voice sang softly, You must never return to Blackmere until it is safe. Aurielle looked toward Lucien in shock. Your father knew where I was taken. Lucien's face changed instantly. What did you remember? Her breathing became uneven again. He told someone not to bring me back here. Silence consumed the entrance hall. Then Lucien spoke very quietly. Which means he feared Blackmere too. The truth does not free people immediately. First, it ruins everything they believed. Snow continued falling through the night over Blackmere Hall. By dawn the cliffs surrounding the estate had disappeared beneath white fog so thick the sea itself vanished from sight. The manor felt suspended outside time. Silent corridors, dim fireplaces, servants moving quietly as though afraid to disturb whatever invisible tension had settled over the house since the winter assembly. Aurielle barely noticed any of it. She remained awake most of the night inside her small servant chamber, staring at the silver key Seraphine had given her. The East Tower Observatory. Hidden memories. Locked rooms. Every answer seemed to lead only toward another secret waiting beneath it. Shortly after sunrise, a soft knock sounded against her door. Aurielle opened it immediately. Lucien stood outside alone, wearing a dark wool coat still dusted lightly with snow. His gray eyes looked colder than the winter morning behind him. "Come with me," he said quietly. Aurielle nodded without question. The manor remained nearly empty at this hour. Only a few servants crossed the lower corridors carrying breakfast trays toward guest chambers. Lucien led her upward through the eastern staircase instead of toward the main halls. Higher, narrower, older. The air became colder with every floor they climbed. Aurielle realized gradually that she had never been this far inside Blackmere Hall before. The eastern tower stood isolated from the rest of the estate by thick stone walls and locked passageways rarely used anymore. Finally, Lucien stopped before a dark iron door beneath the top stair landing. Dust coated the lock heavily. No servant had touched this entrance in years. Aurielle slowly opened her hand and revealed the silver key resting against her palm. Neither of them spoke while she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned stiffly with age. Then the heavy door opened inward. Cold air drifted immediately from the darkened room beyond. The observatory was circular and enormous. Tall windows curved around the tower walls, overlooking the frozen cliffs and distant sea. Dust-covered furniture rested beneath white sheets while shelves lined with old books disappeared into shadows near the ceiling. At the center of the room stood a large brass telescope pointed toward the gray horizon. Aurielle stepped slowly inside. The room felt strangely familiar, not through memory exactly, through emotion, loneliness, silence, waiting. Lucien closed the tower door behind them quietly. "My father spent hours here after the fire," he said. No one understood why. Aurielle moved carefully farther into the room. Dust shifted softly beneath her shoes. Near the windows rested a wooden desk covered with old maps and sealed journals tied together with faded black ribbon. One chair sat pulled slightly away from the desk as though someone rose from it and never returned. Aurielle stopped beside it slowly. Another memory flickered through her mind. Gray winter light. A man seated at this exact desk holding his head in exhausted silence while she stood nearby watching him. Her breath caught softly. "I have been here before." Lucien looked toward her sharply. "What did you remember?" Aurielle touched the back of the old chair carefully. "Your father." Silence filled the observatory. "He was sitting here." The first pages contained astronomical notes and estate observations written in elegant black ink. Then the handwriting changed abruptly several chapters later. Messier. Uneven. Desperate. December 23, 1809. The child survived. Aurielle froze. Lucien stepped beside her immediately. Together they read the faded pages beneath pale winter light. "Evelyn is dead. Ashbourne Manor is gone. I have hidden the girl where neither the Valets nor Blackmere allies will search for her." Aurielle's breathing became shallow again. Blackmere allies. Even the Duke's father feared people within his own circle. Lucien continued reading silently beside her. "If the truth becomes public before the northern agreements dissolve, the child will not survive long enough to inherit anything." Aurielle looked upward slowly. "He really believed I was in danger." Lucien nodded once. "Yes." Another line near the bottom of the page caught Aurielle's attention immediately. "Seraphine knows more than she admits." The sentence chilled the room around them. Aurielle turned another page quickly. The next entry had been written months later. "I should never have trusted Alistair Vale inside Ashbourne that night." Lucien's face hardened instantly. "Alistair." Aurielle looked toward him. "Seraphine's brother." Lucien nodded slowly. "The man Evelyn was originally meant to marry." Aurielle continued reading with trembling hands. "He arrived before the fire spread. He claimed he came to help evacuate the household. I believed him until the west wing doors were sealed from outside. Silence swallowed the observatory completely. Aurielle stared at the page in horror. The fire was planned. Lucien's voice remained cold and controlled beside her. Yes. Aurielle looked farther down the entry. Another sentence had been underlined heavily by Lucien's father years ago. I removed the child before Alistair discovered she survived. Her breath stopped. Your father saved me. Lucien remained silent several seconds before answering. Yes. Emotion tightened painfully through Aurielle's chest. All her life she believed she came from nothing. A forgotten servant girl from a fishing village. Now piece by piece another reality emerged beneath the lies. A dead mother. A destroyed estate. A child hidden away under another name while powerful families rewrote history around her. Aurielle lowered the journal slowly. Why would your father never tell you where I was hidden? Lucien looked toward the snow-covered sea beyond the observatory windows. Perhaps he feared I would search too soon. And did you? He answered honestly. Every year. Aurielle turned toward him fully now. 14 years. Lucien met her gaze. Yes. Why? The question escaped quietly. Why spend half your life searching for someone you never knew? The observatory became still again. Lucien's expression shifted slightly beneath the pale morning light. Not colder. More exposed somehow. Because I saw what losing her did to my father. Aurielle waited silently. Lucien looked away first. After the fire, he changed completely. His voice remained calm but distant now, as though speaking through memory instead of conversation. He stopped attending Parliament regularly, closed most of the estate, spent nights inside this tower reading old records and rewriting legal agreements. Aurielle looked toward the journals surrounding them. Because of me, Lucien nodded once. He believed Blackmere failed the Ashbournes. Another pause followed before he added quietly. And he believed that failure became mine after he died. The confession settled heavily between them. Aurielle understood suddenly. The years of searching, the obsession with records, the quiet way Lucien watched her from the moment he saw the crescent mark. None of it began with curiosity. It began with guilt inherited from a dead father who never forgave himself. Aurielle lowered her eyes toward the journal again. Tears threatened unexpectedly behind them. Not because of wealth or inheritance or noble blood. Because somewhere inside this cold tower room, she realized someone had spent 14 years trying to bring her home without even knowing what she looked like anymore. Her voice came softly. You could have ignored all of this. Lucien answered immediately. No, why not? He looked directly at her then. Gray eyes steady and unguarded for the first time since she entered Blackmere Hall. Because you were never supposed to disappear. The simplicity of the sentence broke something quietly inside her chest. Aurielle looked away before he could see it happen. Then another detail inside the journal caught her attention. A folded page tucked between entries near the back. She carefully pulled it free. The paper contained a map of northern estates marked with ink circles and handwritten notes. One location had been crossed out repeatedly. Dunmere Village. Aurielle stared at it in shock. My village. Lucien took the page slowly. His expression darkened instantly. Someone knew where you were hidden. Fear spread sharply through Aurielle again. Then why did nothing happen? Lucien read farther down the page in silence before answering. Because my father moved you again before the valets arrived. Aurielle looked at him sharply. Moved me where? Lucien turned the page toward her. Another location had been marked farther south near the coast. Whitford Harbor. Aurielle's breath caught painfully. My mother. Lucien nodded once. Your adoptive mother was not random. The realization settled heavily between them. The woman who raised her had protected her intentionally all those years. Hidden her. Lied for her survival. Aurielle pressed trembling fingers against the edge of the desk. She knew everything. Most likely. Another line beneath the map caught Lucien's attention suddenly. His expression sharpened instantly. Aurielle. She looked up. He pointed toward a final note written hurriedly along the bottom margin. If anything happens to me, Lucien must never discover the truth until the girl returns willingly to Blackmere herself. Silence consumed the observatory. Aurielle stared at the sentence in disbelief. Your father wrote that? Yes. Why keep it from you? Lucien folded the page slowly. Because he feared what knowing too early would turn me into. Aurielle frowned faintly. What does that mean? Lucien's eyes lowered briefly toward the old journals surrounding them. He believed obsession destroys people. The answer lingered quietly between them. Then another realization surfaced slowly inside Aurielle's mind. She looked toward him carefully. You already knew part of this before bringing me here. Lucien did not answer immediately. Yes. How much? Silence. Then he spoke quietly enough that the words almost disappeared into the winter air around them. Enough to recognize you the moment I saw the mark. Aurielle stared at him in shock. You knew from the beginning. Lucien finally met her eyes again. I hoped. Some people spend their entire lives searching for home without realizing someone else has been searching for them too. The observatory remained silent after Lucien's confession. Pale winter light stretched across the dusty floorboards while snow drifted endlessly beyond the tower windows. Aurielle stood motionless beside the desk. The old Ashbourne journals spread open between them like the remains of another life. I hoped. The words echoed quietly inside her chest with unsettling force. Not certainty. Hope. 14 years of searching built on fragments, records, and guilt inherited from a dead father. Yet somehow Lucien Ravenshayer had recognized her almost immediately. Aurielle looked down at the faded map still resting in her hands because meeting his eyes suddenly felt dangerous. You should have told me sooner, she whispered. Lucien remained still several feet away. I needed proof. Or you needed control. The question slipped out before she could soften it. Silence followed. Lucien did not deny it. Aurielle's chest tightened painfully. Everyone in this house knew pieces of my life except me. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to steady it. Mrs. Hollowmere, Seraphine, your father. You. Lucien looked toward the snow beyond the windows. You were protected. I was erased. The words shattered more sharply than she intended. Lucien turned back toward her immediately. Aurielle finally met his gaze fully. Do you understand what that feels like? She asked quietly. To discover your entire existence belonged to strangers and secrets? Lucien's expression hardened with something deeper than restraint. Regret, perhaps. Yes. Aurielle frowned faintly. No. You do not. My father spent his final years obsessed with finding a child he believed Blackmere failed. His voice remained calm but heavier now. Everything in this house revolved around a ghost no one else could see. Aurielle remained silent. Lucien stepped closer slowly. Do you think growing up beside that felt normal? The question stopped her. After he died, every responsibility became mine overnight. His gray eyes held hers steadily now. The estate, parliament, debts, alliances, and a promise made by a dying man who believed an innocent child disappeared because our family was too weak to protect her. Aurielle felt something shift quietly inside her chest. Not forgiveness. Understanding, perhaps. Lucien looked away first. I searched every northern village by the time I was 24. His voice lowered slightly. Every orphan registry. Every church record. Every surviving servant connected to Ashbourne. Aurielle stared at him. 14 years, she whispered again. Yes. Silence settled softly between them. Then another thought surfaced suddenly through her mind. The first moment in the gallery. Lucien looked toward her again. When I dropped the tray. Yes. You already suspected. Lucien answered honestly. The mark confirmed it. Aurielle lowered her eyes briefly toward the crescent hidden beneath her sleeve. The small pale shape had changed everything. She laughed softly once beneath her breath. All my life I thought this was nothing more than an odd birthmark. Lucien's expression softened almost imperceptibly. It was your family crest before you understood what crests meant. The observatory fell quiet again. Somewhere below them, the great clocks of Blackmere Hall began striking noon through the estate corridors. 12 slow echoes drifting upward through stone walls and frozen air. Aurielle moved toward the tower windows overlooking the cliffs. The sea had finally reappeared through the fog below, dark and endless beneath the winter sky. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Lucien joined her beside the windows after several seconds. "Legally, in every way," he considered the answer carefully. "The missing inheritance records complicate matters. But not permanently." No, Lucien's gaze shifted toward the journals on the desk. "There are enough surviving documents here to reopen the Ashbourne succession case if necessary." Aurielle looked toward him slowly. Meaning Aurelia Ashbourne still legally exists. The name settled heavily between them. Aurelia, not a ghost, not a servant, not a forgotten child hidden beneath another identity. Real. Aurielle swallowed slowly. "And if the Valets fight it?" Lucien's expression cooled instantly. "They will, because they benefited from my disappearance." "Yes." Aurielle looked back toward the storm-dark sea. "Then all of this becomes war between families." It already was. His calm certainty unsettled her again. Another silence followed before Aurielle asked the question haunting her since the nursery corridor. "Do you think Seraphine truly regrets what happened?" Lucien remained quiet several seconds. "I think Seraphine spent 18 years living beside men capable of destroying people for power." "That is not an answer." "No," he looked toward the falling snow beyond the glass. "It is the only honest thing I can say about her." Aurielle nodded faintly. Somehow that answer felt more trustworthy than certainty would have. Then movement far below the cliffs caught her attention through the observatory windows. A black carriage approached the estate gates through the snow. Fast. Lucien noticed it immediately. His expression hardened. "That is not one of ours." Aurielle felt unease move instantly through her chest. "Who is it?" Lucien stepped toward the brass telescope without answering. He adjusted the lens carefully before going still. "London Legal Crest." Aurielle turned sharply. "Already?" Lucien lowered the telescope slowly. The valets moved quickly. A cold realization settled over the room. Someone had informed London already. The missing heir was no longer a private secret inside Blackmere Hall. Aurielle looked toward the journals again. "Then there is no hiding anymore." Lucien met her gaze steadily. No fear should have overwhelmed her. Instead, another emotion surfaced beneath it. Anger. Quiet and unfamiliar. Someone stole her life. Her name. Her family. And now they expected her to disappear again before the truth became public. Aurielle straightened slowly beside the observatory window. Lucien noticed the change immediately. "What are you thinking?" She looked toward the distant carriage climbing the snowy road below. "I am tired of being hidden." Something shifted behind Lucien's eyes then. Respect, perhaps. Or recognition. Aurielle crossed back toward the desk and carefully closed the final Ashbourne journal. "You said Aurelia Ashbourne still legally exists." "Yes." "Then perhaps she should stop living like a servant." Silence filled the observatory. Lucien watched her carefully as though realizing something important in that moment. Not the frightened girl from the servant corridors. Not the invisible maid who lowered her eyes whenever nobles entered rooms. Someone else entirely beginning to emerge beneath the years of silence. Aurielle looked toward him calmly. "If this becomes public, what happens inside Blackmere?" Lucien answered without hesitation. "Every alliance changes." "And you?" He held her gaze. "Everything changes." The honesty in his voice tightened unexpectedly around her chest. Another knock sounded suddenly against the observatory door before either of them could speak again. Mrs. Hollowmere entered breathlessly. "Your Grace." Lucien turned immediately. "What is it?" The housekeeper looked toward Aurielle first. Not Miss Whitford anymore. Something in the older woman's expression had shifted permanently. The London barrister arrived with official succession inquiries. Silence. Mrs. Hollowmere swallowed carefully. And Lady Seraphine requested the entire household gather in the grand ballroom immediately. Lucien's expression darkened. Why? The housekeeper hesitated only briefly. Because she intends to announce that the Ashbourne heir survived. The observatory became completely still. Aurielle felt the final wall around her old life collapse quietly inside her chest. No more hiding. No more silence. Down below, somewhere inside Blackmere Hall, servants were already lighting chandeliers and preparing the ballroom where nobles once ignored a floor made carrying silver trays through crowded corridors. Aurielle looked toward the storm beyond the windows one last time before turning back toward Lucien Ravenshire. Then let them see me.